Hello YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Feel like some biscuits, Clippy? Cool. Well, you can stand there and eat your bickies. And the fool on the hill will read from the New Scientist magazine, 9th of April. You happy with that, boss? Urgent climate warning. For some reason, the scientific community and the media community, they stick with that term climate change, which is a weaselly term. What we're dealing with is global warming. Climate change is what the fossil fuel lobby decided to speak about when the public began to become frightened by global warming. They started saying, oh, no, it's not global warming, it's climate change. But anyway, let's not argue about the semantics. UN panel says the world must make rapid, deep cuts to emissions to hold off extreme climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions must peak within 3 years. 3 years, boss. You reckon we can do it in 3 years? Hey, can we do that? Global emissions must peak within 3 years to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, according to the latest research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, (IPCC). In a report on how countries can tackle the climate crisis, published on the 4th of April, the IPCC warned that the window for staving off a highly dangerous warming has shrunk drastically due to past failures to act. It found that the world can afford to emit just 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide from 2020 onwards for a 50% chance of holding the temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Scenarios modelling how to meet that tight carbon budget require emissions to peak by 2025 before falling 43% by 2030 on 2019 levels. And it's already 2022. It's already 2022. We have to peak by 2025 in 3 years' time, and then 5 years after that, we have to be 43% lower in global carbon atmospheric emissions than we were 3 years ago in 2019. That's a kind of a shit oh dear message. Like, golly gosh, it's all I can say. That would require a gargantuan effort given global emissions rose by a record 5.5% in 2021. We're not only not achieving anything good, we're going in the wrong direction. Many governments are also preoccupied with the war in Ukraine and the coronavirus pandemic, and some are mulling extra oil and gas production. Coal use must drop by 95% by 2050 on 2019 levels, oil by 60% and gas by 45% to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, figures that Jan-Christoph Minks, one of the authors of the report, said are, quote, very striking. Even meeting the Paris Agreement's weaker target of 2 degrees Celsius would leave, quote, a substantial amount of fossil fuels unburned and render up to $4 trillion of fossil fuel infrastructure stranded. We need to end the age of fossil fuels, said Minks, speaking at a press briefing. Like the swamp wallaby on the lawn, our chances of achieving the required cutback voluntarily and by sane and rational means are retreating into the distance. getting smaller as we watch. The report says governments aren't doing enough yet. Tallying pledges made before last year's COP26 climate summit, the world will likely exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius this century, a vital threshold for avoiding the most extreme effects. The report is a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world, said Antonio Guterres at the UN in a statement. Yet the IPCC found reasons for hope. At least 18 countries have managed continued emissions cuts for more than a decade, while the costs of key technologies for decarbonisation plummeted between 2010 and 2019. Rapid and deep, unquote, reductions will be needed across all sectors using a mix of renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, lower energy demand, better energy efficiency, and a huge ramp up of ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, such as direct air capture machines, says the report. Well, some of that's kind of fairy story. Carbon capture and storage use was found to be, quote, far below, unquote, the amount needed to reach climate goals. Perhaps because it doesn't bloody work. For the first time, the IPCC also considered the role of behavioural changes on emissions reductions, such as shifting diets. Quote, the way we move around, the way we eat, the way we generate energy, everything needs to change, unquote, says Pete Smith, an IPCC author. Despite claims in some quarters that cutting emissions will be too expensive, the IPCC says that mitigation costs for meeting the 2 degrees Celsius target would be, quote, small, quote, compared with global GDP growth and would be 1.3 to 2.7% lower in 2050 than in a business as usual world. The report is the third of 4 that make up the IPCC's, quote, 6th assessment report. The first was on the cause of climate change, the second was on the impacts. The new report was signed off after an approval session that saw the launch postponed by 6 hours. The delay was due to Saudi Arabia's requests around language on long-term fossil fuel use, India's views on carbon budgets and future economic growth, and a row between the US and China over financing to act on climate change, delegates told New Scientist. So, Saudi Arabia wants to keep selling oil, India wants to keep burning carbon, and America and China are arguing over who gets to pay for trying to stop shitting in the sky. You still listening to this clip here? Okay, so we go over the page. 1.5 degrees Celsius goal is barely still in reach. Look at that, stock footage of Townsville, Queensland, Australia, 2019. The IPCC's report shows that we have the tools to make fast cuts in emissions, but there's little sign of the political will to act now. The message is very clear. In 3 instalments, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has told us that humans are, quote, unequivocally to blame for rising temperatures. We are outstripping our ability to adapt, and on the 4th of April, that we can fix this crisis. The fix requires us to ensure that global greenhouse gas emissions peak in 3 years and are cut by 43% by 2030. He softens that blow. He doesn't tell you it's 43% below 2019 levels. And we're in 2022 today. Achieve that and we have 50% chance of staying under the 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, the threshold for when climate impacts become far more damaging. More damaging than that. And in Lismore, where they had 2 record-breaking floods a month apart, Yet, as the IPCC itself points out, without stronger policies from governments, global emissions are projected to keep rising beyond 2025. The current trajectory is for a planet that is warmed by a hellish 3.2 degrees Celsius. So what reasons are there to think the world can land at 1.5 degrees Celsius instead? There is no good historical precedent for such rapid and deep emissions in reductions. Global emissions were just under 60 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents in 2019, after factoring in everything from fossil fuel burning to land use changes such as forests cleared for farms. Emissions have grown despite years of United Nations climate talks and swift deployment of renewable energy projects. The rate has slowed though. Average annual growth was 1.3% between 2010 and 2019. It was 2.1% in the decade before, yet reaching a plateau remains elusive. COVID-19 restrictions delivered a record fall in fossil fuel emissions in 2020, but a coal-fueled rebound in 2021 wiped out those savings. Emissions are expected to rise this year too. The world missed a chance to restructure its energy and transport systems with pandemic stimulus packages. The current energy crisis, exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, presents another possible inflection point. Jim Skee, co-chair of the IPCC's Working Group 3, which produced this week's report, says scientists are conscious that getting emissions to peak by 2025 and almost halve by 2030 represents, quote, a big change of direction, unquote. However, he adds, quote, what the report absolutely makes clear is that we are not talking about business as usual if we are going to address the challenge of climate change. So we don't look at the immediate past and say, we expect that pattern to continue, unquote. The report offers a bounty of ways to avoid business continuing as usual for emissions. Wind and solar power have the greatest potential when it comes to making cuts, with nuclear offering a much smaller supporting role. Meanwhile, we must switch from fossil fuels to electrification to heat buildings and power cars, scale up alternative fuels including hydrogen, improve energy efficiency, and implement carbon capture and storage in sectors such as heavy industry. Reducing emissions isn't just about technological fixes, quote, demand-side strategies, unquote, which means behaviour changes such as switching to more plant-based diets and flying less, could cut emissions by between 40 and 70% in all sectors by 2050. Among the 60 actions that individuals could take to curb consumption, walking and cycling are identified as offering the biggest potential emission reduction. The IPCC also hints that the richest in society, could deliver the biggest cuts if people curbed their consumption of goods and services. The 10% of households worldwide with the highest per capita emissions are responsible for 45% of all consumption-based household emissions. No time to lose. The good news is that in a world where money talks, many of the measures needed are cheaper than the cost of not acting. Both the main types of solar power, plus offshore and offshore wind power, are already at costs that compete with fossil fuels in many places, says the report. The prices of key technologies have plummeted, such as the cost per kilowatt hour for lithium-ion batteries falling by 85% between 2010 and 2019. Well, golly gosh, they must have been expensive before, because last year I paid $700 each for 3 spare batteries for the electric push bike, because I'm not silly enough to think that busyness as usual is going to be any kind of an ongoing possibility with what's in the pipeline. So where were we? Lithium-ion batteries prices falling by 85% between 2010 and 2019. The IPCC makes clear that there is still technically a path to the safer haven of 1.5 degrees C world, but there is little sign of the political will to embark on that trail. Last year, 196 countries promised to, quote, revisit and strengthen their national climate plans in 2022. To date, none has. Scientists are usually reluctant to say when the totemic 1.5 degrees Celsius target will be out of reach, but Skier admits that it will be, quote, gone if more ambitious plans don't arrive before the next UN climate summit in Egypt this November. Time is almost up. Skier insists that making sure emissions peak within 3 years is still feasible. But as he tells New Scientist, the longer we put off action in terms of addressing climate change, the bigger the feasibility challenges will be. I see. Isn't it amazing? All the science says that the only possible way to maintain the homeostasis mechanisms of the biosphere and to give the ecology a chance of staying alive is for humanity to stop burning fossils. And rather than sensibly, rationally, reasonably taking concerted, well thought out action, what we're going to do is attempt to grow the economy until the wheels fall off the ecology. And if planet Earth decides to take a hand in beating us into submission, then that's what's going to happen. It's like the Monty Python song. And then you better pray that there's intelligence up above because there's bugger all down here on Earth. Although the critters that live around here would no doubt feel a bit sad when they didn't get their breakfast bread in the morning, on the whole, I can't think of a species anywhere on Earth that wouldn't be fairly relieved if humanity was to just stop burning fossil fuel. And if the only way to get humanity to stop burning fossil fuel is for humanity to render itself a really rare and threatened species, and I don't think there's any other species on the planet who are going to be too upset by that. Because particularly in the last 12,500 years, we have been taken over by the broadacre death cult of harvest everything-ism. It began in Turkey 12,500 years ago, or what's now Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, with a midden that all of the seeds were wild harvested 12,300 years ago. 30 years later, the first hybrid seed appeared in the midden. 300 years after that, all the seeds in the midden were hybrid strains. 400 years after that, Göbekli Tepe had been abandoned twice. And all of the people who grew up in the latter stages of harvest everythingism at Göbekli Tepe, the survivors did the diaspora thing. They set off in all directions. If you take a satellite view looking down on Earth with Turkey at the centre of your picture, you can see where they went by the devastation, the deforestation, the exposed topsoil. They fanned out. And initially limited to whatever stone tools, I guess, they had. I mean, the stonemasons at Göbekli Tepe were working on limestone. You know, it was pretty easy. They didn't make a huge impression initially. But then, 6,000 years ago, in the flat steppe land between the Caucasus Mountains and the Baltic Sea, not the Baltic, the Black Sea. That's That's where this tribe called the Yamnayans appeared. Tall, warlike, horse milk drinkers. And they were in the habit of spreading out sideways, presumably looking for grass for their horses, because if you have a horse in your paddock, you're living with a drought. And they weigh half a ton, and they've got hard hooves, and they haven't got any more complicated a digestive system than a rabbit. So a horse is going to eat, like 4 times as much as a cow, while doing the same amount of damage to the environment topsoil wise. Horses have to keep moving. You can't keep a horse on one place or it just dies. The place. And then the horse. Because if they shit on the ground, they get to eat their own worm eggs and they go wormy and die unless you've got a major pharmaceutical industry to keep them alive. Very expensive to keep a horse. So these horse milk drinkers called the Yamnayans came out of where Ukraine is these days. And they conquered their neighbours, and they put all of the men and the boys to the sword, and they married or enslaved the women, and then when the horse needed more grass, their descendants moved on. And they adopted the cultural habits of the women in the land that they were accreting. And they went from Ukraine to the Atlantic coast of Spain, and from Ukraine to the Pacific coast of Siberia and China. They went all the way down to the bottom of India. They went all the way up to Norway. They arrived on the coast of Britain, England, and the English were making Stonehenge, having a great time, making big calendars and looking at the seasons and predicting where the sun was going to rise on the horizon. The Yamnayans arrived. The British stopped making Stonehenge because that wasn't interesting to the Yamnayan men. And within 100 years, according to the archaeologists, who, I don't know how the paperwork operates on this, but they have access to old burial grounds, and DNA technology means that they can say with certainty, and I read it in a New Scientist magazine, that 100 years, within 100 years of the Yamnayans arriving on the coast of Britain, there were no British Y chromosomes anywhere in the British Islands. The Yamnayans took over everything on the Eurasian continent, north pretty much of the Sahara Desert. They didn't get below the Sahara, they didn't get to North America, and the first Yamnayan to show up here was Captain Cook, when he shot the first Aborigine to encounter the Royal Navy. And the Ukrainians seem to be having a great amount of battlefield success right at the moment with a drone made in Turkey. Isn't that weirdly coincidental? Turkey is where the broadacre death cult of harvest everythingism started, and Ukraine is where the fucking Yamnayans emerged. And yeah, back in February I prophesied, predicted, projected, guessed that if Ukraine was successful in using NATO's anti-tank shoulder portable rocket technology in stopping the Russian army, then it would become increasingly tempting for the Russians to close off the West's ability to supply Ukraine with these weapons, and they would go after the logistical supply line. And at some point there's got to be a risk of Russia damaging NATO units or NATO damaging Russian units as the NATO people are, I don't know, driving. Well, take the Bushmasters from Australia. What happens to them? They put them on an aeroplane, they fly them to Poland, then they've got to drive them to the border and drive them across. If the Russians decide to attack them while they're right on the border, to send a message to the rest of the Western world and not supply the Ukrainians, what does that do to the NATO-Russian relationship as to whether they're in a war or not? At the moment, the Americans have tipped to the idea that, well, we've got a helicopter. I'll come back to this. What do you think, boss? Helicopter? It's big and it's heavy and it's a turbine, and it's probably going to be the aeromedical retrieval helicopter. Birds are flying away. I don't think so. Oh yeah, Westpac Rescue, aeromedical retrieval. Someone in Glen Innes has fucked it up. Okay, back. I think I was talking about the more or less imminent likelihood of Russia deciding to throttle the West's ability to supply Ukraine with modern weapons, which are carving bloody great big holes in Russian military logistics and battle fighting ability, by going after the choke points in the supply line between the West and Ukraine. What that's going to do to the status of whether there's a war going on or not, I don't know, and that's what I was about to point out. There's a couple of principles of sociology which I picked up in New Scientist a few years ago. One of them, you know, you have to assume that humans are primates. I realise there are people who think that humans are something special. We're not animals. You know, you can't lump us with the primates, but anthropologists and sociologists have discovered that not only is the vocalization wah what all primates give forth whenever they are sufficiently angry, sufficiently hungry, or sufficiently frightened that they're prepared to kill even members of their own species, but also the more often any primate individual fights, then the more often that individual primate fights away from their home territory. The mechanism is apparently a cranky individual who's perhaps been neglected or abused as an infant constantly wants to measure himself against other people by dominating the other people. So all the individuals who grew up around that individual primate, they well aware of the temperament and they can't be bothered with the bullshit, so they just back off, go away, do something else. Don't hang around with that fella because you know he'll want to punch you in the head eventually. So the cranky pants individual primate has to go far away from their home territory to find a stranger who doesn't know them, and then they befriend the stranger, and then they have a fight, arguing. So that's one mechanism. The more often a primate fights, the more often it fights away from home. The other one is the more often the primate fights away from its homeland, the more often it loses. So you've got Russia trying to have a fight in Ukraine. I think the Russians would dearly love NATO to get involved because then the Russians have the ability to escalate to a whole new level with a nuclear first strike option because they want to re-establish their empire before the fossil fuel economy falls over. Just like China would like to establish a global empire before the world economy falls over when fossil fuel stops being an option. It's a kind of a race. You know, we've built this great big military. Let's use it before we lose it. So the Americans have apparently finally, eventually, at long and at last, they've got a hold of the idea that if they send the American killer monkeys to Ukraine, they're going to be further from home than the Russian killer monkeys are. So America will probably have a great deal of difficulty supplying their own killer monkeys in the field. But if the Americans furnish the Ukrainian killer monkeys with all the latest whiz-bang death technology at $44,000 a shot for an NLAWS, $120,000 a shot for a javelin, but they're like magic anti-tank death rays as long as you fire them within 14 seconds before the coolant in the battery runs out. So be very sure that you've got a target before you switch them on. But the point is, if the Americans can limit themselves, if NATO can limit themselves, if ANZUS can limit ourselves, because, you know, we sent them a check for $70 million, sent it straight to NATO and said, spend this on things that go bang, and then ship the things that go bang across the border. And now we're sending 4 Bushmasters to the aeroplane load, and I think we're going to send them 20. So if we can limit ourselves to doing that, so we are not the ones fighting off our home territory, then I can see the West has a good probability of beating the shit out of Russia, especially if the Europeans can bite the bullet and wean themselves off Russian oil and off Russian gas. So first you switch off the hydrocarbon tap in Russia, and then you blow each other apart with an atomic war in the Northern Hemisphere, then there's no market for China or India, as well as there's no spare parts for any of the complicated stuff that they can't make to keep their own fossil fueled industry running. Meanwhile, global warming is going to be ramping up and ramping up and ramping up at the same pace that we increased our consumption of fossil fuels and the same rate that we increased our emissions of fossil fuels from 1997 to now. The weather is going to get proportionally that much worse from now for the next 25 years, even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. So between what the IPCC has to say and what's actually going on in the world with all these rampant bloody lunatics trying to re-establish airline flights at the same levels that they were before COVID, and other people trying to get cruise ships up and going again. I think what is most likely in the pipeline is that the war in Russia and Ukraine is just going to expand to the point where it engulfs NATO, and then they'll nuke themselves. And then everybody else will just have to cope with the fact that there aren't going to be any fossil fuels in the pipeline. Here in Australia, it will be particularly harsh because not only will everybody lose their mobile phone and their auto bank and their cash register that's computerized and their car's ignition with the first lot of electromagnetic pulses when Pine Gap gets bombed, but also with no grid, there won't be any way of getting the cash register to tell the Bowser pump to suck what refined transport fuel there is in the underground tanks under the concrete at the service station and put that into anybody's vehicles, not the police, not the army, not the air force, the navy, not the state emergency services or the ambulance or the fire brigade. We're just going to come to a screeching fucking halt as soon as the fossil juice gets switched off. And because we don't have any maritime tankers, there's no way we can get the theoretical Australian share of America's strategic petroleum reserve in a salt mine in Texas. We're not going to be able to get it here, and we haven't got the refineries to refine it anyway. So yeah, we're going to be back to Shanks's pony when the Ukrainistan war blows up and goes nuke you later. And if there's a fallout plume from Pine Gap reaches here, well, you know, I used to eat plutonium on the cornflakes on the porridge in 1963. If there's an overshot from a warhead onto Amberley outside Brisbane, you know, that might come close. If there's a drop shot on somebody going for Canberra or Jervis Bay or Sydney, or you know, because Williamtown Air Base is in Sydney, yeah, that could do interesting things. But basically, it's just going to be a death of 1,000 cuts as the economy grinds to a halt. Certainly, nobody's going to be flying helicopters from Lismore to Glen Innes to pick up people because they've had a car accident or they've broken their leg or something. We have lived very, very high on the hog. And the pig's just about fucking dead by now, as far as I can see. Sorry, the news is not better, even on the endangered species sanctuary. Look at that, I rhymed. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Take it easy and stay safe. Ciao. Vote green or die. Global warming culls. Don't forget to tell all your friends. And then they won't be able to say they didn't know. Or is that too harsh?